August 1950, the Korean Peninsula is ablaze. The North Korean People's Army, equipped and trained by the Soviet Union, has pushed UN forces to the brink. Outnumbered and outgunned on the ground, American and UN troops, together with the Republic of Korea Army, hold the line along the Pusan Perimeter, the last remaining pocket of a free South Korea. The crisis at Pusan began with a surprise attack that caught the world off guard. Just 2 months earlier, on June 25, 1950, over 100,000 North Korean troops stormed across the 38th parallel in a lightning offensive. Armed with modern Soviet-made tanks, artillery, and aircraft, the North Korean People's Army, or NKPA, smashed through South Korean defenses, capturing Seoul in just 3 days. Their goal? To unify the Korean peninsula under communist rule. As Pyongyang's forces swept south, the US rushed to mobilize a regimental combat team from the 24th Infantry Division to stem the onslaught. Using C-54 Skymasters, troops and equipment were ferried from Japan to Pusan in South Korea under a 3-phased plan to counter communist forces devised by General Douglas MacArthur. This included rapid delaying actions, the creation of a holding line above Pusan, followed by an amphibious invasion behind enemy lines. But a shortage of C-54s limited the number of troops and equipment available for immediate deployment as part of the initial pillar of this strategy. As a result, the first American troops sent into combat, under the banner of Task Force Smith, had only a fraction of the manpower and resources they needed. In the words of one critic, Task Force Smith was never configured for a combat mission, but for the airlift available at the time of its deployment. It was assigned a regimental combat team mission with less than 10% of the necessary resources. Positioned directly in the path of the North's most powerful divisions, including those equipped with T-34 tanks, this small US force faced impossible odds. Incredible acts of bravery followed, in which American troops suffered heavy losses and inflicted the same as the North Korean army pushed towards Pusan. Republic of Korea troops, including those from the 11th and 13th Infantry Regiments, also put up a strong fight against overwhelming odds. In the end, all of these efforts were in vain, as North Korean forces captured Daejeon on July 20th, before taking the city of Jinju on the 26th. By late July, under mounting pressure, the United Nations mobilization was in full swing. American troops, comprising 90% of all international forces, were steadily streaming into Pusan. To fortify the city, the commander of the 8th U.S. Army in Korea, General Walton H. Walker, ordered the creation of a defensive line known as the Pusan Perimeter in the first week of August. UN forces utilized the Nadong River as a natural defensive barrier, establishing positions along its eastern bank and extending the defensive line eastward toward the Sea of Japan, approximately 100 miles north of Pusan. This perimeter sealed off the southern tip of the peninsula, forming the last stronghold against the North Korean advance. It was at this moment that General Walker issued his famous "Stand or Die" order, saying, "There is no line behind us to which we can retreat. There will be no Dunkirk. There will be no Bataan. A retreat to Pusan will be one of the greatest butcheries in history. We must fight until the end. If some of us must die, we will die fighting together. Any man who gives ground may be personally responsible for the death of hundreds of thousands of his comrades. I want everybody to understand that we are going to hold this line. We are going to win." Until this point, the U.S. Far East Air Force, the air component of U.S. military operations in the Pacific, have been playing a focused but growing role in the conflict. President Truman swiftly authorized the use of U.S. air power in response to the NKPA's advance across the 38th parallel. On June 27th, Japan-based F-82 Mustangs on patrol over the Korean peninsula shot down 4 North Korean aircraft. The following day, B-26 bombers targeted the Munsan railroad yards and transportation routes near Seoul, while B-29s from Okinawa struck bridges and North Korean invasion forces along key transportation routes. And by June 29th, Douglas MacArthur had approved Air Force operations to bomb airfields in North Korea itself, leading to further B-26 raids across the border Throughout June and July, Japan-based F-80s, B-29s, and B-26 Invaders were regularly striking North Korean ground forces and other targets, including bridges and infrastructure, facilitating the enemy advance. These efforts were accompanied by a campaign to crush the technologically inferior North Korean Air Force and gain complete air superiority, an objective that was achieved quickly. At the onset of the conflict, the North Korean Air Force was equipped with just 160 aircraft of World War II vintage, such as the Yak-7 and IL-10, making it no match for American air power. Even so, disputes over the application of air power between U.S. Army and U.S. Air Force leaders sometimes undermine the full potential of American air assets in the opening months of the conflict. In addition, the Far East Air Force had other problems. Tasked primarily with defending Japan from a Soviet attack, the Far East Air Force had only a small number of aircraft available for operations over the Korean Peninsula: 26 B-26 Invaders, 22 B-29 Superfortresses, 32 F-82 twin Mustangs, and 365 F-80 Shooting Stars. The large number of F-80s presented a challenge for the Air Force due to a lack of advanced airfields in Korea to support them. With Gimpo and Suwon air bases quickly captured by North Korean forces, F-80 jets were forced to operate from bases in Japan, over 310 miles from the Seoul area. This limited their loiter time over the combat area, giving them only a small window of opportunity to strike enemy targets, a problem compounded at the time by limited wing racks to deploy anti-armor munitions. Nevertheless, Shooting Stars played a vital role throughout July, conducting almost 200 sorties per day, inflicting heavy damage on North Korean troops and communications targets. To bolster operations in Korea, the Far East Air Force converted 6 F-80 jet squadrons in Japan to F-51 Mustangs, which were capable of operating from rugged airstrips in Korea. This gave them more time in the air and the ability to carry heavier payloads, including napalm, which proved highly effective against tanks. These aircraft were first deployed in small numbers to Korean airfields Taegu and Pohang by mid-July and began combat operations almost immediately. During the Battle of the Pusan Perimeter, American commanders had 7 F-51 Mustang squadrons at their disposal, with 3 of these crucially operating from airfields located directly within Korea. At least one American ground commander said that a single F-51 flying from Taegu was as effective as 4 F-80s operating from Japan. F-51s using thermite and napalm bombs proved particularly effective at destroying Soviet-built armor, which contained enough rubber in the treads to make them vulnerable to even a near miss from these weapons. Although US air power helped to slow the North Korean advance towards Pusan, it couldn't stop it entirely. By early August, the North Korean People's Army had converged on the UN's defensive perimeter around Pusan from 3 critical directions, advancing toward Masan from the west, Taegu from the northwest, and Pohang from the north. In some areas, they even managed to establish bridgeheads across the Nakdong River, breaching the defensive line held by UN forces, including the First Battle of the Nakdong Bulge, running from August 5th to August 19th. The relentless advance of enemy troops also forced the evacuation of some US Air Force units from Taegu, as well as the complete evacuation of Pohang Airfield, just weeks after they had been occupied. But it was at this moment of the conflict, with the US and UN forces entirely surrounded, that American air power came into its own. With the North Korean army pushing up against the Pusan perimeter, its reliance on long lines of communication made it highly vulnerable to air interdiction. Korea's rugged terrain, marked by rivers, ridges, and rice paddies, posed significant challenges for cross-country movement, especially for motorized vehicles. This forced the North Koreans to depend heavily on a network of roads and railways, many of which relied on bridges. With the United States commanding air superiority over the Korean peninsula, and the enemy lacking substantial anti-aircraft defenses, B-29 bombers were able to strike key targets with precision, often operating from altitudes as low as 10,000 feet to devastating effect. This disrupted the North's logistics, slowing reinforcements to a crawl. Meanwhile, close air support and battlefield air interdiction proved critical. F-51 Mustangs and B-26 Invaders launched relentless attacks on enemy troop positions and incoming convoys, cutting off supplies of food, fuel, and ammunition. The Far East Air Force alone influenced the outcome of battles via the close support of ground troops, with total close air support sorties increasing to nearly 7,400 in August, from over 4,600 in July. This was equivalent to 238 sorties per day. In the first week of August, Corsair pilots from the USS Sicily began close air support operations over the Pusan Perimeter in support of ground forces. In addition, Carrier Task Force 77 soon joined in support of defensive operations in the south. This subjected North Korean troops to Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps air attacks, with strikes targeting their positions along the front lines and extending deep into their rear supply, transportation, and logistics zones. This sustained pressure, delivered through close air support interdiction and strategic air-to-ground operations involving heavy bombers, disrupted the NKPA advance and weakened its operational capabilities. It forced North Korean forces to confine their movements to the cover of darkness, significantly restricting their mobility during the Battle of the Pusan Perimeter. Nevertheless, the ability of US air power to shape events on the ground came despite strategic, logistical, and communications problems that blunted the full effect of close air support operations over the Pusan Perimeter. In August, for example, about 30% of Navy close air support sorties were cancelled due to communications problems. Even so, by mid-August, North Korean forces were suffering under the strain. Daily rations for soldiers had been halved from 800 grams to just 400 grams, most of which was rice. Truck losses mounted as airstrikes targeted transport routes, forcing North Korean units to hide vehicles during the day and operate only at night. Airstrikes on rail infrastructure were so devastating that it took a full month for North Korean reinforcements to travel from Pyongyang to Pusan. These and other disruptions led to a cascading shortages of supplies, with ammunition deliveries plummeting from 166 tons per day in late June to just 17 tons by mid-September. The air campaign also demoralized enemy troops. North Korean prisoners later cited hunger and constant fear of airstrikes as major reasons for their surrender. Air power also played a pivotal role in halting the NKPA's last-ditched and final full-scale attempt to seize the Pusan Perimeter, known as the Great Nakdong Offensive, which raged from September 1st to September 15th. Strikes from aircraft armed with napalm devastated massed infantry formations and destroyed tanks in their tracks, preventing breakthroughs that could have overwhelmed UN defenses. F-51 Mustangs played a critical role in supporting embattled US troops, with one notable account describing how their precise and relentless close air support rescued an entire company of soldiers encircled by NKPA forces. Nevertheless, the desperate North Korean troops maintained pressure across the entire Pusan Perimeter in early September, and it led US military leaders to mobilize every available air asset in response. On September 3rd, the Far East Air Force launched a massive strike against the communists that included 249 close support and 89 interdiction sorties, coupled with huge bombing raids by 35 B-29s that hit equipment and troop concentrations close to the front lines. As September wore on, the relentless combination of air attacks and the determined resistance of ground forces finally halted North Korean offensive operations. General Walker noted, "I will gladly lay my cards on the table and state that if it had not been for the air support that we received from the 5th Air Force, we would not have been able to stay in Korea." General Walker's stand or die order, backed by the firepower of the skies, had bought the coalition precious time to regroup and prepare for a counteroffensive, and one that would turn the tide of the war.